So let's begin. Welcome, everyone. I'm Linda Elder, and I'm coming to you from the Foundation for Critical Thinking. We are focused on the topic, what critical thinking can do for human societies. This is June the 30th, 2022, and I'm going to just start with some thoughts related to this topic, and then I'll give you time for some questions. So if you can hold your questions, that will help me. And let me, by way of introduction, say that this was somewhat difficult for me to prepare for, because to me, the answer is almost simple. And the answer is this: it can do almost everything for human societies. So by that, I mean that critical thinking enables us to reason at the highest level of quality, no matter what we're reasoning through or reasoning about. So critical thinking should provide us tools that we need to do that. So in other words, whatever you do in your life, whatever your profession is, whatever your extra, as it were, curricular activities are, whatever you're doing in your life, the quality of that engagement depends directly upon the quality of your thinking about what you're doing. So and to me, some of critical thinking is so easy, it's hard. So for example, we are continually reasoning. You get up in the morning and you start reasoning. You reason throughout your day. You, I, everyone, we reason as well as we can, given our circumstances, our knowledge, right? Our abilities to think critically or not. So reasoning is with you always. You are continually engaging in it. The question is, how well are you reasoning? And so we can ask ourselves, all right, for example, I could say, make a list of the big problems that we face living together as humans. What are the big issues? What are the big problems? So then if you wrote those down, you think of a few, you're thinking of a few right now. Then when you look at that, you realize that if we thought critically or at the highest level that we possibly can about that question, we could answer it most likely. So why is it that, for example, let's take the problem of sustaining the Earth's resources. So now this is a multi-logical problem, and many people are reasoning about this problem. They're reasoning about the larger questions, and they're reasoning in a more narrow way. So you have a specialist that's working on the oceans and how we're destroying the oceans. So that person may be thinking critically about our impact on the oceans, let's just say. But it doesn't follow that that person is also thinking critically about how they treat their children, or in any other part of their lives. Do you see? So it doesn't follow that if you think well within one part of your life, that you think well within any other part. Because here again, another problem, another barrier for us, the mind is naturally compartmentalized when it wants to be. In other words, we don't naturally integrate all of our best ideas. So, okay, so there are many ways to approach this question: how can critical thinking help the human species? But one of the early moves that we have to understand to address this is we have to understand the role that reasoning plays in human life. And we need tools for reasoning at the highest level of quality, because the more we are applying critical thinking within all the domains of our lives, the better we will be achieving our goals and the higher goals in terms of the common good. So where does that leave us? Well, there are many sort of ways in which we can approach this question. And let me jump in with one way of approaching it. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the specifics that we would need to engage in to be bringing critical thinking to the human species, so to speak, and some of the benefits. And then we'll wrap it up with the overall, let's say, theory of critical thinking that we are advancing in our approach, which many of you are familiar with because I see some familiar faces. So what I want to do now is to share my screen and to show you a page from the Liberating the Mind. And this book is available for purchase through our publisher. And you also have a number of pages available to you in our community online if you're a member. And right now I'm on the community online, as you see, if you're a member, and I'm looking at page 164, if you want to go back to this, in the book, Liberating the Mind. So what I want to focus on first are 20 barriers to critical societies. And then as we go through this list, we won't necessarily go through all of this, but I want you to take this barrier and to turn it into let's say its opposite. So let me show you what I mean by that. So what can we're remembering our background question here always, what can critical thinking do for human societies? All right, so first we need to realize that people, number one, are typically only superficially aware of critical thinking. So imagine that instead of this in human societies, we had people who were deeply aware of critical thinking. And then take number two, a barrier to critical society is that people cannot clearly articulate the ideal of critical thinking, know it, and they know of it only or mainly as a positive buzz term. So imagine the opposite of that. Imagine a world in which people were clearly articulating the concept of critical thinking in daily conversation. And we were not thinking of it as a buzz term as we are now, but we were saying, if somebody says, for example, you know, the problem is we're not thinking critically about this, so you should be able to make this move. Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean we're not thinking like you are thinking? Because you see, that's one of the barriers to critical societies. So what we want to do is be imagining a world with the opposites of these. So number three, another barrier, most people uncritically accept the traditional mainstream views and beliefs of their culture. So what can critical thinking do for human societies? It can help people avoid uncritically accepting traditional mainstream views and beliefs. Do you see what I mean? So in other words, what we need to see is how to, what we need to understand is that if we're trapped in mainstream views, if we have no ability to critically analyze and assess the views of society, then we're going to be an impoverished species, an impoverished culture. So number four, most people are culture bound, enslaved within social conventions. Imagine the opposite, where most people are not culturally bound and are not enslaved within social conventions. They're able to critically analyze social conventions. So imagine a world where people were not just following along what everyone else was doing. They're not looking for validation right and left. They're asking themselves, does it make sense to believe this? So that is another thing that critical thinking can do for human societies. So again, going through all these, you can see how turning it around would be the ideal. Most people uncritically accept the views of authority figures. And does this lead to problems? So critical thinkers do not uncritically accept the views of authority figures. And they realize that however well a person reasons, generally, that person can always and will always make mistakes. So critical thinking enables us to see this. Most people, number 6, are not aware of and do not attempt to explicitly use intellectual standards in their thinking. So imagine a world where people were, instead of not being aware of the standards they're using to determine what to accept and what to reject, they were using standards like clarity. Am I clear? Accuracy. Is this true? Is this, as people now say, a true fact? You see, that's sad that we have to put the word true in front of fact for people to actually think that the fact is a fact, because a fact is by its very nature true, right? So we need people to be able to adhere routinely to these intellectual standards: clarity, accuracy, relevance, breadth, meaning we can think through the complexities in all of the questions that we have to face. I'm sorry, breadth means, breadth means we're considering all the relevant viewpoints. Depth means we're focusing on the complexities within the issue. Are we thinking in a sufficient way? Have we gathered all the relevant information, or are we just including the information that supports our viewpoint? So what can critical thinking do for human societies if we were embracing it? We would be using this language. We would be saying, I don't really understand what you just said. Could you just say that in other words? I'm not sure how that's relevant to what the question is that we're focusing on here. All right, so we've thought about the issue from this point of view. We've gathered all the evidence supporting our position. We see that we could support our position if we had to, or if we wanted to. But what are the viewpoints that don't agree with our position, that are relevant to thinking well through the question? So these are moves that we would be making in fair-minded critical societies routinely. Now, just a few more, and then I'm going to move on. Most people do not understand human thinking, their own or others, or the impediments to reasonability. So we can't just have this theory and say, just learn this theory and you'll be fine. We have to realize that we all have a dark side. We have an egocentric side that is the part that holds our intellectual arrogance, the part of us that needs, again, validation, the conforming side, the part that is intellectually lazy. So we need to embrace intellectual virtues as well as intellectual standards, intellectual virtues of intellectual humility, intellectual courage, intellectual integrity. So if you're new to this, you're probably feeling a little overwhelmed, like what you're thinking, well, what is all of this? This is a lot of theory she's throwing at us. And the fact is that critical thinking is theory. It's theory that we apply to everyday life. But we've got to have the ideas to make the changes in our lives. And we know that if we look at human societies, that in many ways we reason well. And in many ways we reason quite poorly. And we're not able to coordinate our best thinking. Again, take the environment, the sustainability issue. We don't have enough groups working together to solve this problem. And then we have, of course, big money working often against this, right? So we're critical thinkers are able to see all of the realities and not just see what we're being told here, just going along with what we're being told by authorities, by the news media, and so forth. So, all right, now we can go through the rest of these. Some of these, let's take number 11. Most people are uncreative and unoriginal. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with critical thinking? Well, critical thinking, if it doesn't have a creative dimension, is simply skepticism. It's just finding all the problems in. And of course, we need to find the problems in our thinking. But if you can't build on that, if you can't come up with solutions, then you're failing in critical thinking. So critical thinking provides tools for the creative dimension, as well as the finding of the problems, and the two come together. So in other words, if I see a problem in my thinking, then I have to create new thinking to intervene in the problems in my thinking, or to replace the problems in my thinking. That's a naturally creative process. And so the best thinkers are continually thinking critically about their thinking, and they're creating new ideas that are important in some dimension of human life. So most people are trapped in, you could say in here, number 12, trapped in their social class, but we're also trapped in many other ways. We're trapped in our egocentricity, our selfishness, our inability to see another viewpoint. We're trapped in our social groups. We're trapped in our professional groups. And in critical societies, this would not be the case. So what can critical thinking do for human societies? It can make us more creative, more original, less trapped in all kinds of ways, and so forth. One of my favorite ones here is number 18, that people are sometimes surprised at. Most people do not value true spontaneity, naturalness, or artlessness. So you see, a critical thinker realizes that there are many times in life when you need to relax your mind and set yourself free, so to speak. So you may see a person on the beach who's just, doing somersaults or whatever, somebody dancing around, doing something that might seem a little odd, right? But that person is just enjoying the universe, enjoying the beach, enjoying nature. And so this is also a part of critical thinking, because critical thinking helps us see ourselves as a total, let's say, as a whole. We don't reserve critical thinking for just one part of our lives. We ask ourselves, well, for example, how am I applying critical thinking to my mental well-being? You see, one thing that critical thinking could do for us is to help us become a lot more mentally well. Because mental illness often comes from an inability to control your reasoning. And this is a challenge for every human being. Your mental well-being is a personal challenge that you face. You have faced it from the minute you were born, really. But let's just say since you were a very young child, and you've maybe struggled with this, and where you did, there was probably some problem in your reasoning that critical thinking can help solve. Now, this requires the will to change and the belief that you can change, that you can be, as it were, captain of your ship. But mostly people do not look at their lives that way. They look at their lives in compartmentalized ways. First I do this, then I do that, and then I this part of my life, and Sundays I go here, and Saturdays I go here, and so forth and so on. But if someone were to sit you down and say, well, how are you doing though in life? Then you might have to pause and say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I mean, overall, how do you feel on a typical day? How do you feel on a typical moment? Are you basically happy within yourself, with the self that you've created? You can say, well, I didn't create myself. Somebody else created me. My parents created me. And then I'm going to say, then you don't see the tools of critical thinking available to you. Because critical thinking should help you shape yourself in the way that you want to be. And also, again, in keeping with the common good, let us say. So let me move on and make a few more points, and then I'm going to pause. I'm still working in this book, the book, Liberating the Mind. And we have, beginning on page 170, we've listed 6 hallmarks of critical societies. And we can read some of these and you can ask yourself, if we were embracing these principles, how would that help the human species? So in critical societies, critical thinking is highly valued. And it is highly valued when people in the culture see critical thinking as essential to living reasonably, rationally, and fruitfully. Now, I can ask you this, to what degree is this a reality in human groups? To what degree do we see critical thinking as essential as humans? And I think the answer is we don't, because mainly people don't know what it is. How can you see it as essential if you can't give us a reasonable definition of what it is? And so critical thinking is now a term being thrown around, but then we need to be able to ask again, what is it? And we need to be able to elaborate that. So critical thinking is highly valued when people come to understand from an early age that the development of their thinking takes precedence over their development in every other skill area. And this is true because you always are reasoning if you are human. You may also be a piano player. You may also be a tennis player. But even there, your reasoning is at the heart of those activities. You don't play the piano without reasoning. You don't do any activities that require multiple skills without critical thinking. So the development of thinking has to take precedence. So imagine a world in which we were teaching the language of critical thinking first, and then we go from there. All right, so then I'm going to skip forward to a few other main points here. The problematics in thinking are also a hallmark of critical societies. And the problematics in thinking are an abiding concern when people in the culture recognize that everyone falls prey to mistakes in thinking and therefore are constantly on the lookout for problems in their own thinking and the thinking of others. See how different this is from the way we're living now, where we don't want to admit that we have any problems in thinking? We're not supposed to say that we have a problem. We're not supposed to admit that we made a mistake. So everyone's hiding their errors, hiding their mistakes. So that's not going to solve the problems that we face. So, and when people systematically discourage closed-mindedness and systematically encourage open-mindedness. So right now, people are encouraged to think in narrow ways. And we are moving increasingly in this direction so that we're not thinking so much in terms of how we can create egalitarian societies. I mean, when was the last time you heard anyone protesting for that? Egalitarian societies. It's about rights for my group, for my, you know, and those groups become more and more narrow. And I'm not saying that those activities are not important, but I am saying that if we valued critical thinking the way we should value it or could value it, we would be dealing with most of the human problems that we face. So And instead, we just try to think as well as we can about this and then that, and then this and then that, and all the little problems that we face, or the big problems that we face. So it's like popcorn instead of an integrated approach. So what if we all learn the tools of critical thinking? How would that help us deal with these big problems that we face immediately? And we could do that. We have the abilities, we have the capacities to solve these problems. So the problems, and the problematics in thinking are an abiding concern when people in the culture recognize, again, egocentric and sociocentric thinking as significant barriers to criticality. And so each of us has now the challenge of determining when and where and how we are egocentric. So in other words, when is my thinking getting in the way, and how can I catch myself in narrow-minded thinking? And how can this become a regular habit of mind? So then that brings us to the intellectual virtues. Now, let me just give you an overview of the intellectual virtues that we tend to focus on first. And I've got multiple pages here. So if you haven't seen this before, I want to show this so that you could see that in our approach, what we argue is that we want to think of critical thinking not as a set of skills, but as a way of living, a way of life, in which we embrace these intellectual virtues. So imagine a world in which everyone were embracing and working toward the embodiment of these intellectual virtues, such as, let's just say, intellectual empathy. Intellectual empathy means I can throw my thinking into your thinking, and I can think your thoughts as well as I'm able to, given that I'm not you. So, and I'm doing that in good faith. And I'm doing that routinely. I'm doing that regularly. I'm trying to understand that position that is in disagreement with my position in order to learn from it. But typically, people are the opposite of that. They're narrow-minded in their thinking, and they're sticking to their view no matter what. And that view may be dooming us as humans. So intellectual empathy is just one of the intellectual virtues. And then here are some of the others. Intellectual autonomy. So this is the opposite of intellectual conformity. So if you have intellectual autonomy, you can think for yourself. And yes, you would like other people to think at a reasonable level, but if they don't, then they just don't. As long as I am aspiring to that, that's what I have to do. And now I may agree with you or may disagree with you, but I've got to do my own thinking. And intellectual integrity means that I mean what I say and I say what I mean. And I don't expect anyone else to live at a higher level of criticality than I myself am able to achieve. And confidence in reason means I follow the facts wherever they lead me, even if I don't like where that's leading me. So let's say you're in a bad relationship, romantic relationship, and you see these facts about this partner that you have, but you don't want to see them. So you're not looking at them. You're blocking the bad parts out. But the bad parts, let's say in this example, are really a problem for you. So now what you have within yourself is a contradiction. So now you're living with a contradiction, and you're living with it every day. It could be haunting you. So you really want to get out of the relationship, but you can't bring yourself to do it. You really can't, deal with this other person behaving in this way, but you just can't make any moves to get out. You see, this is a way to become insane because your mind is battling itself. And as long as we have these egocentric and sociocentric things happening, we're not going to be able to bring critical thinking to human societies in any big way. So then some other intellectual virtues here, just very briefly, that intellectual humility means that I know the limits of my knowledge. And I'm aware of my weaknesses. I'm aware of my strengths. Let's say after doing a webinar, after I finish, I'll be going back over my mind. I'll be thinking, well, I made that. That was a pretty good move, but I could have done something else here. You see, so I'm analyzing, sort of naturally going over it. And sometimes you can overwork that, right? You can be doing a fairly good job and think that you're not. You can be too hard on yourself. So you want that assessment to be accurate. And so, but in any case, we embrace mistakes when we embrace intellectual humility. And we're able to say, I really, I could have done a better job on that in the following way. So next time, that's what I'll do, or whatever the case may be. Lots of people lack intellectual perseverance. Many people have the capacities to achieve, but they're not achieving because they don't have the will to achieve. So how do we humans develop the will to address the problems that we face living together on the planet? And then intellectual courage means I have the courage to examine my own thoughts. I'm not afraid to examine my thoughts. And so this is at the heart of let's say, the development of intellectual character. And so now I'm going to ask you to imagine a world in which everyone were learning these intellectual virtues from childhood, and we were discussing them, and we were helping each other develop them. Imagine a world like that. Can you imagine that? I mean, it's a little difficult, isn't it? Because we're not doing this now. So we have to begin to learn this theory, and we've got to begin to apply this theory much more so than we're doing now. So then let's look at another diagram. So if we ask the question, what can critical thinking do for human societies? One thing we need to understand is that the outside of this diagram is all of this represents a contextualization of critical thinking. So in other words, let's take professional fields. So what we need to be able to do is to apply critical thinking, the whole toolbox of critical thinking, to the way we think within the professions. We need to apply the theory of critical thinking to building a critical society, which is what we're talking about now. We need to apply this process to Socratic questioning, how we even question ourselves and others, applying it to our personal life. And I just talked about our mental well-being. This is a part of our personal life. So I can say imagine that in the center here, instead of the elements of thought, standards, and traits, I just have critical thinking. Okay, so it's another way of looking at this. So I need to think critically about or through all of these dimensions and any other form of thought. Did you follow that? So what we need is what critical thinking can do for us is it can help us reason better within every one of these domains of thought. And right now, what we're doing is, of course, there is a lot of critical thinking happening already without the explicit tools. I grant that. Without the explicit tools of critical thinking, we have a lot of critical thinking going on. But we obviously do not have enough for us to be able to solve the big problems that we face. And some of them are they're enormous, like the threat of nuclear disaster. And so this is a threat that hangs over us. And the health of the earth is another, as I've said, big threat. So what I'm saying is that, yes, there is a lot of critical thinking happening, but if we were to embrace these explicit tools, we're going to see a lot more movement forward in terms of advancing critical societies. Now, what we're lacking then is contextualization within these fields. We have many contextualizations. We have many of them on our at the community online, in the libraries, and so you can visit those. But there are many, many more that need to be developed, and this is the job of all of us to apply critical thinking to all the parts of life that we could apply it to. So now let me pause for a minute, and before I do though, let me just show one more thing. So I'm going to pause and see what your questions are at this point. But before I do, I want to point this out to you. So for those of you who are new to our approach, this is a good way in. So we've talked a little bit about cultivating intellectual traits or intellectual virtues. And this is what would be required to really bring critical thinking to human societies. But to do this, we need to be able to do other things as well. One is analyze our thinking, meaning taking it apart and looking at the parts of our thinking. And then we need to be able to assess thinking. Once we do that, we need to have reasonable standards for assessment. Now, I've already mentioned some of those: clarity, accuracy, depth, breadth, logicalness, and so forth. But we also have to be concerned with the barriers to criticality. And again, I've mentioned these egocentric and sociocentric thinking, and there is a lot to, of course, both of these concepts. So what critical thinking can do for human societies is it can help us reason better within every domain of human life. Critical thinking can help us reason better in terms of our own mental well-being. Critical thinking can help us develop actual fair-minded critical societies where we're working together in good faith to solve the problems that we have as humans, and considering the rights and needs of other sentient creatures. And so, but it's going to require knowledge of the theory of critical thinking. And it's going to require knowledge and application, knowledge and application. And this is a relationship that goes back and forth, you see, and it keeps, they keep informing one another. So let me pause here and see what questions or thoughts any of you have at this point. And just, if you could raise your digital hand, that would be the easiest, probably, because I think I'll be more likely to see that. Yes, Ivan.
Thank you for the presentation. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you've said. I do have a question though. Are you familiar with the rationalist community, like lesswrong.com?
Give me some of the theory you'd like us to discuss.
So the rationalist community is very focused on Bayesian reasoning. So it's a relatively mathematical approach to, when I say mathematical, it's based on mathematics, but it's relatively accessible. Mm-hmm. And their view is a little more mechanical. It's like you have deduction, you have induction. Bayesian induction tells you how much you should update your confidence in a theory given the evidence. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it would be very complementary to what you're doing, because it sort of gives a point of focus that is something that could be taught in a school system.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of theories that connect with our approach, and there are some theories that are concepts that I would say are more secondary, and some of them I think muddy the water a bit. And inductive and deductive reasoning, of course, are coming to us from history, and mathematical reasoning is important in many parts of human life, but it's only a part of human life, right? So this is why we have to know how and where to apply any of these given theories. And we have to ask whether that really adds to our knowledge of critical thinking. In other words, is it really a significant addition to the theory that we're already having difficulty getting people to learn? Do you follow me? So in other words, and there's a lot of secondary theory that we teach as well. For example, fallacy theory. The fallacy theory is well and good, but it's not going to replace the elements, the standards, and the traits. So the elements and the standards and the traits come first, because reasoning is what we fundamentally do. We need to know what is involved in reasoning. So we understand now that reasoning, whenever we reason, we have a purpose. We ask a question or questions. We use information. We make inferences. We begin with assumptions connected to our concepts and our point of view, and all this leads to implications. So now that's going to take some time to internalize, and then the intellectual standards again as well. So these other ideas again may be very useful, but we have to then add to, right, what is already again difficult to teach. And it's, so anyway, thank you for that. I don't want to dismiss it. I just want to make a general point about theoretical approaches. And let me say this, there are a lot of different theories let's say research studies that show, a given phenomenon, right, in human life. And any of those in of themselves may be valuable, but what we need is an integrated approach to the mind that already takes that into account. You see, that's, so cognitive, what is it? Cognitive bias. What is the word? The term that's used now in psychology. It has to do with bias.
Yeah, cognitive bias.
Yeah. So that's a narrow conception, but it's fine as it stands. It's just that it's one in a list. And so the human mind doesn't think in list form. It thinks in insofar as we can, in an integrated form. So if you give me one thing so you can say I might be prejudiced in certain situations, okay, that's one idea. But what about all the other things that could be going wrong with my thinking? And there is a lot of this, and these insights are coming from many different fields, and these insights can add to our conception of critical thinking. And for some people may say, well, I really get a lot of mileage out of this though. And I would say, well, then get that, do that, that's fine. But we've got to come up with a general language for everyone that's accessible to all humans that come to education and that, or come to an educational setting, let's say a school setting. So anyway, thank you for that question. There's a lot in the answer, and hopefully I did address it to some degree. And now Patrick, yes.
Thank you, Linda, for the presentation. I'm just curious. You have been mentioning about how to apply critical thinking in our societies and also in our personal lives. I'm just thinking, how do you transition from critical thinking or thinking about your own thinking to now making a decision, having detached your ego, having detached the society that you are existing in? Mm-hmm. So how do you transition from the critical thinking, having all the intellectual standards, and then now transitioning to making a decision and now taking action while detaching the ego and the society that you are in?
Well, I think that what you have to do, that's a good question, and it illuminates some of the complexities in living a human life, right? So that's one of our ultimate challenges is to do our best thinking, and realizing though that our thinking doesn't, as it were, just sit there. It goes somewhere. It takes us places. And one part of thinking critically is to know when and how to make a move. So often, some people will have the problem that they don't really trust themselves. So after you've done your best reasoning and you've said, I've tried to make sure I'm not being egocentric and I'm not being sociocentric, then I'd say, then go for it, right? I mean, that's the best you can do, but you've still got to make a move. And when you make the move, it could be the wrong move. So in other words, there are no guarantees. Critical thinking doesn't guarantee that you'll make the right move. But what it does do is it make it more likely that you will make a better move or one of the best among the possibilities. But the inability to act on good thinking is a problem in thinking. Do you see? So if you've done your best thinking, then you're ready to make a move, but you're saying, but maybe there's something else. Well, yeah, maybe there is, but you don't know what it is, and you've exhausted everything that you can. You see, you've done your best thinking in context. Now we make a move. And then maybe later you say, well, I didn't really gather all the relevant information, but I thought I had. So that's just part of living, right? So you've got to make sure that you do have confidence in your ability to figure things out, confidence in yourself, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
So in short, you can't really detach ego and society from the critical thinking.
Well, yes, you can, because I'm assuming first that you in a given context situation, you've made sure you're not being egocentric. In other words, you've made sure that you're not being selfish, you're not distorting anything to serve your views or your interests. You're not hiding from any facts. And of course, the mind can tell itself that it is doing all those things when it's actually not, right? In other words, that's part of the problem that we face with the mechanism of self-deception, always ready to tell us that we are right or that we're not capable, right? Self-deception can lead us into all kinds of mistakes in thinking and problems. So you can't get rid of your ego. You can't get rid of your irrational need to be validated, but you can keep it in check. You can keep a handle on it. And that's what we need to shoot for, so to speak. And then we have to live. And it's much better to go ahead and make the moves. And maybe you make some mistakes, but you're not always holding back. Do your best thinking and then go forward and act on your thinking.
Thank you for expounding on that and adding to my understanding.
Thank you for the question. So other questions, comments on this? Now, you could ask the question, what, you see, do you see how critical thinking, if we were to embrace it fully as humans, would solve most of the problems that we face? But that would require a lot of the human species to be on board with this. And to date, if you just think about the history of critical thinking or the history of deep thinkers. So we've had critical thinking since, let's say, Socrates or before, but we didn't have the term critical thinking, right? But we did have the phenomena that are we had critical thinking occurring. There have always been people who have thought critically in human societies. It's just that group has been much more narrow. In other words, there have been so few of them. That's my understanding. And it's also, it connects with my experience with teaching it and working with people over many years. So there are some people who will rise to criticality, but now many of them are reasoning well within a domain, like someone like, let's say, Einstein. So Einstein was very good at thinking within certain scientific areas, but not so much in his personal life. And so critical thinking is there for us to think better in all the parts of our lives. And this will be required for the achievement of fair-minded critical societies. So we've always had critical thinking to some degree, but the number of people who seem to be able to rise to it have been a small percentage of people. That's my reading. I hope I'm wrong. Jim, yes.
One of the things that it seems that you're talking about here is the idea of making our thinking object, of being able to think about our thinking, the metacognition aspect. You mentioned earlier that you practice a reflective part after, say, giving this presentation tonight. You may use some particular tool like after action review or some other critical thinking methodology. How would someone, are there some better ways? Are there some methods that you might suggest for cultivating more critical thinking? Are there some ways, in addition to kind of learning from our experience of making critical, using reasoning rationally, reasoning critically, applying it, looking at the results, and then going back and saying, oh, here's what I missed, or and maybe over time even seeing patterns to our thinking? Are there places to start within the critical thinking, all the tools that are available? Are there, do we start with one area that is like you mentioned Einstein, maybe start with the field that we're really the expert in, and then try to generalize? How would you suggest we go about developing critical thinking more broadly?
Yes, it's a great question. And the answer is there are many possibilities. Okay, so, right. So learning critical thinking and teaching for it, if you're teaching for it, is an art. This is an art. It's not a science. So, and it's not linear, right? This isn't a presentation where you have 5 big ideas and that's all you need to know. And so you can do reading, and here I'm at our community online. For those of you who are members, you've seen this, and hopefully those of you who are not will be joining us. We have a library of publications for everyone. We have the largest library on critical thinking online in the world. And here you have access to all of our thinkers guides in part. We have sections of all of our thinkers guides here. So there's a lot of reading material as a starting place. Miniature guide to critical thinking concepts and tools, analytic thinking, the human mind. Those top 3 are good places to start for reading, just to get your feet wet in terms of reading. Then I would suggest, of course, the videos. There are many videos here that you can view in the community. And there's, for example, there are videos on the elements of reasoning, intellectual standards, intellectual virtues, the problem of egocentric and sociocentric thinking. These webinars are here, and Gerald, Dr. Nosich and I have started a podcast series focused on going deeper into the theory of critical thinking. So we typically are introducing the theory. Here we're taking each of the elements. We're starting with each of the elements and we're discussing them. It's quite a lot of fun. You can see Gerald laughing. So we have a lot of fun there, and you can visit this section, and then the Academy section enables you to do activities focused on any one of the main theoretical sets. So here we have the wheel of reasoning, the elements of reasoning. And now we can do, for example, the logic of a problem. You can do the logic of a problem in your life. What is the problem? What is the key question that emerges from the problem? What is the purpose in addressing the problem? So you can analyze your own problem. Here's an example. You can type in your answers here, you see. Now, you don't get the cheat sheet, right? There's no answer here to your problem. But you can learn to use the elements of reasoning through this kind of template in working through the logic of a problem. And then when you finish, you can save it, and you can print it, you can share within the community. And then you can look at this interactive model, which shows more on the elements and the standards and how they sort of are integrated. And then you can do the logic of a profession, the logic of a subject, the logic of your discipline. And you can, again, write that out. And here are some sample logics that we've created. So for example, science, we ask you to do your work first, and then once you do that, you can see our example. So this is what I would strongly recommend, that you work through activities here, and you can choose the ones that jump out to you. For example, you may want to focus on the relationship between thinking, feeling, and wanting, or the barriers, which focus on egocentric and sociocentric thinking. And so here, these are all activities, starting with analyzing a self-centered person you know well. Notice it doesn't say analyze yourself first, because that's a lot harder. So if people actually go through these activities, there is so much that you will learn about yourself. To what extent are you egocentrically dominating? To what extent do you dominate other people or sentient creatures to your will, and without regard to their needs and desires? So we're asking you to write about it. Write it out. And this is how we get to the dark side. So people often think of these activities as sort of like, an add-on. I do not think of these as add-ons. I think of these as the core, because what I see again and again is people saying, yeah, that makes sense. I like the elements, the standards, and the traits. But that's not what this is about, and that will not bring about critical societies. We have to be digging into our own minds and say, okay, yeah, you were egocentric when you said that, Linda. You need to realize that, you see, or whatever the case may be, and make a correction. So hopefully that helps give you a sense of some moves that you can make to learn critical thinking. And we're going to have a conference next month, so hopefully all of you will be joining us for the conference, where we'll be doing a lot of activities together. Other questions, comments before? Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
So I'd like to ask one or two of you, if you'd be willing to say one thing that you're getting from this. And some of you have been coming back again and again, so I'm really interested in how you're developing as you're attending these webinars, but I also want to hear from anyone new. So what are some of the things that you're taking away from this? Is there anything that you're taking away that it's like, this is something I learned that I didn't really know before, I hadn't really thought about before?
The thing that you said about skepticism and the difference between critical thinking and skepticism is creativity was pretty profound.
Mhm. That was Keith, right? No, who said that?
Yeah. Thanks.
Keith, thank you. Yes, that's interesting because I don't often talk about that, but you see, I assume that to be true, and I know the relationship, but often I don't think to be explicit about that piece. And you know that anybody that's a highly skilled artist is also thinking in a critical way about their art. So thank you for that. Other comments? Things that you've learned?
Linda, this is Nancy.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. So amazing to be in a Zoom room with you, and all of you for that matter.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah. One thing you said at the end of your presentation, if I understood it correctly, is that we have to learn about critical thinking in order to learn how to think critically. But I wonder what that means for our youngest critical thinkers, because even young students can think critically, if I am correct in my understanding of critical thinking. So obviously their level of what critical thinking is and what the elements of reasoning are, or any of those vocabularies or structures or concepts, are going to be quite limited. And so I wonder, do older students have to necessarily know about critical thinking deeply in order to learn how to think critically? Because there's also the case that we know people certainly who are better, seem to be innately better at thinking critically than others, even if they haven't learned formal structures. So I just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah,
about
that's
that.
a lot.
Thank
There's
you.
a lot in that, and that's true. It's true that there are many people who naturally think critically in certain ways, and but it doesn't follow that they're thinking critically across the domains of their lives. That's one very important point, and usually not. And so they're not necessarily thinking of how to integrate their skill sets across all the parts of their lives. They typically don't have command of their self-deception. And so in other words, you can think at a high level of quality and still be highly self-deceived in certain ways. And even if none of that were true, in other words, even if we said, well, look, some people just think better than others and they're just naturally skilled across the domains of their lives, and they, you know, if we could, even if we were able to say that, it still doesn't help us with all of the people who don't naturally do that, right? So if you don't naturally have these skills, if you don't naturally, you're not a natural linguist, how do we get you to think critically about language? If you see you don't read and you don't write, it's not natural to you, so to speak. So that's why critical thinking, this toolbox, is essential for everyone, in my view, because all of us can improve our thinking. And if you don't have any tools for improvement, how do you just get better at thinking? So, okay, well, what we want you to do now is just get better at thinking. Well, how though? So this is why we all need the tools, even if we are at a high level. Any given person may be at a relatively high level. And it's true, people have thought critically through history, as I've mentioned, so you're connecting with that. And there are always exceptions to this. Some people who are, someone like Nelson Mandela, who was just a very good thinker in many domains of his life. But if you read his autobiography, one of the things you see in this is his own ability to critically analyze his own mistakes. And the very fact that they got caught was a gross error in judgment. And he says that, we got careless. So you got careless, and so you lost 26 years of your life. You see? So this is Mandela, who was thinking well in all of these ways, right? But one big mistake is, you see, could be not a fatal mistake, but almost. So this is why we have to, that we all need these explicit tools, because they remind us of the pitfalls that we face and that we're likely to fall into any one of them. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And Jose.
Yes, hi, Linda.
Hi.
I have a question. I do know that you offer a lot of courses for teachers, K to 12. And the intention or the intent of those training or that education is to get the teachers to actually remodel a little bit their lessons in order to introduce or inject critical thinking aspects to the students. I personally believe that that is the right way to go, because we as adults already are a little bent in terms of our intellectual virtues, and it will take a lot of work, for us to correct the course. But for the children, is a different exercise. Now, my question is this: let's say I'm a professor, a teacher of history or geography or science, and I go attend some of the courses and I get trained, educated is a better word. I get educated on how to remodel my lesson to introduce critical thinking. And I'm teaching to a 4th grade or 5th grade student. Give me just one idea, one example of how I would remodel my lesson of chemistry or my lesson of history or my lesson of geography to introduce critical thinking skills or interest or practice.
At the elementary level?
Let's say elementary.
Well, so it's funny that it's interesting that you brought up the example of history, because I was actually thinking today about how you could, let's just take a little bit higher grade level for a minute, but as a kind of pattern, let's say I'm teaching a history class. Let's say it's a junior high school class. And let's say at the beginning, I start by asking the students on the first day, okay, what do you know about history? And they're going to look at me like, what do you mean by that? And I'm going to say, now you've been through how many years of school and you've been taught history, how many years? So what have you learned? What do you know about history? And then they're going to not have much to say probably. And then I'm going to put them into groups and have them continue that discussion. I want to know everything that you know about history. Do you see now in the very beginning, I'm teaching them to have confidence in their own reasoning. What do you know? You've been to school, you've been taught something. What was it? And now they're going to be saying some vague things, right? And then I'm going to say, all right, now I would probably use Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. So now I would have them read chapter 1, and now I would say, how does this change your view of history? Because that's in essence one of the primary purposes of that book, is to help people see that history is always told from a perspective. And then Howard Zinn is saying, let's look at it from the perspective of the oppressed classes. Let's look at US history from that perspective. And then you could say, well, to what degree have you learned anything about what Howard Zinn is focusing on here? And so you see, these are just this is more like a way of talking, do you see, in the class, so that people see. And now here's another move you can make. How do you tell the history of your life? Because you yourself are a historical being. And do you have command of that story that you tell? And do you deceive yourself about that story? And do you, as it were, lie about that story? Do you indulge bad memories from your past? Because if you do, that's going to get in the way of your mental well-being. So do you see how your historical thinking about your past affects your mental well-being? So these are some moves that you can make if you understand historical thinking. And I want my students early on to get this, if they get nothing else. Every history book that you read, every history book, every historical account, every single one is told from a historical perspective. And therefore, it can be judged accordingly. That is, the tools of critical thinking are needed to judge that perspective. To what degree is it accurate? To what degree is it relevant? To what degree is it significant, broad, deep, logical, and so forth? So these are some early moves. Now go down to a much lower level. Let's take let's say you're reading stories to your children at the youngest levels. Maybe they can't even read yet. So you read them the story of the gingerbread man. And if you remember the story of the gingerbread man, the lady cooked the gingerbread, and there was a man that, she made a gingerbread man, and he jumped out, and now he's trying to stay alive, and everybody's running after him, trying to eat him, basically, right? And he's trying to get away. So with this story, we can say, okay, what is the purpose of the gingerbread man? What's he trying to do? And what is the purpose of these other people? What are they doing? And which of these points of view are you siding with? The one who's trying to get away, or the one that's trying to eat the one? Do you see? So you can easily bring in purpose there, you see? So you can bring in purpose to all of the characters. Every time we read a story, we can ask, what is the purpose of this character? So that's an early move we can make with little children. I can teach the concept of an inference, the concept of inferences to very young children in the following way. So an inference is this. It's when your mind sees something and it thinks, so it says that is true, therefore something else is true. So the mind takes a step. And so let me give you an example of that. So let's say I'm talking to little children, right? So you get up in the middle of the night to get some water to drink, and you come downstairs and you see in the house next to you what looks to be a flashlight, a light going around the room. That's what you see. That's what your mind perceives. What might you infer? And all their hands go up, of course, at that level. They know all the answers, even though they may not know it at all. But okay, so they'll say, okay, so what might you infer? They'll say, there's a burglar in the house. All right. And then you'll say, okay, all right, that's a possible inference, and it may be true. But what might also be, what might be happening instead of that? And somebody will say, well, maybe the light went out and they had to use a flashlight, or they'll come up with some reasonable inference. And then you say, there you go. So you have that inference, or you have this inference. So you need to know that every time you make an inference, you could have made a different one. So we can start teaching this at a very young age. But notice what this presupposes. It presupposes that the teacher has this knowledge. Because you don't just infuse critical thinking into the curriculum as it stands. You have to be able to think independently about the curriculum. And K-12 teachers are not typically taught to do that. They're taught to teach what is bought, right? To just hand that over to the students. This is a big barrier to K-12 schooling education in this country. So anyway, those are some examples. And I, could give more, but there are many, and it's a way of teaching. You see, it's a way of living. And when you understand this theory, then you can see how to bring it into the classroom. Often what a teacher wants is just give me a strategy. It doesn't really work that way. You've got to have the theory, you see, to come up with the strategies. Does that help?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Patrick.
Thank you, Linda. Mine is to comment on your question that you had posed earlier about what has been the benefits of the webinars. And one thing that has stood out for me has been the application of the standards, intellectual standards, to any thought element. And I've realized that using it and applying those standards, especially, for example, seeking clarity or depth or breadth. Personally, when I use those standards, it brings out my authenticity. And when I weigh it or put it onto another person who maybe I'm having a conversation with, it makes them also have a fairer understanding of the problem, and it elevates then our discussion and even the decision that we make. So that has been the benefit of the webinar.
Wonderful, excellent. Yeah, so we need to use these tools and see how they work. We need to use them, use the standards, use the elements, use the barriers, and use any one of these, and you begin to see your movement forward. So thank you for sharing that. And one last one, Terrence.
Hi, Linda. Sorry, first time here, just trying to learn a lot. I had a question since you mentioned Socrates, and since you were talking a lot about establishing critical society and all the barriers with it. I'm really curious, why is there an incentive for people to do that? I mean, if they have the capability to think critically, if they have the capability to use this knowledge for their own sake, I mean, why should they? That's kind of like the question. I mean, Socrates was killed for that, wasn't he? So in today's society, like you mentioned, even just disagreeing or agreeing with people on like current issues doesn't really happen a lot. So if somebody has that capability, they can kind of just use it for their own benefit, really. I mean, like there's no reason for that.
Yes. So in other words, if I understand you, let's take early on, Richard distinguished between three kinds of characters: fair-minded friend, so a fair-minded person is for children, fair-minded friend, selfish Sam, and naive Nancy. Then obviously the gender doesn't matter here. So the fair-minded critical thinker is the person who is thinking at the highest level of quality while considering the rights and needs of others. The selfish thinker is thinking critically while pursuing his or her own purposes without regard to the rights and needs of others. So the ethical dimension is missing in the selfish person. And then the naive thinker is someone who just says, thinking just doesn't matter. I'm not the one who's the thinker. I go along with other people because I'm not that smart, that sort of way of thinking. And that's more at the unconscious level, obviously, than the conscious level. So what I think you're saying is, look, what if you're a successful selfish Sam, then what is your incentive to change? And this is a big part of the problem that we face, because and this is what Socrates said, you must have and you must develop the ethical dimension in yourself and in societies. And if ethics is missing, what you have left is sophistry. That is what he was working against. This is the very thing that you're talking about now, that's happening now, is sophistic thinking, which is thinking well within your viewpoint. And so the only way to intervene in that, I think, is to, at a very young age, help people see that they don't want to be that way. And this would never work for everyone, no matter how well we were advancing critical societies, because there are always going to be outliers, right? There are always going to be horrific conditions under which people live. And so we have to realize that. But if we could early on teach these concepts, and then we could, I believe, get further toward cultivating critical societies. And the reason I say I believe is because I don't know, because it's never been done.
Okay. No,
And-
thank you. That kind of answered that.
And I do think if you were to work with little children, if you work with them, you can get people at a very young age to say that they don't really want to be selfish. That they see that in themselves frequently. But if we don't intervene, and that becomes a pattern, you see, and there are no voices in the other direction, there's nothing to counter that, then that person who's likely to go along that path is going to, as you say, it's going to be very difficult to get them to work toward the common good. I mean, just think the very concept of the public interest is not something that we even hear politicians talk about, for example, the public interest. That's why they're there, for the public. And yet, what are they doing for the public? And so this is a big problem. And this is why we need critical thinking at the elementary level. And this is why when Richard Paul first started this work in 1980, in one of his first books was a K-3 handbook for teachers. But over time, because he said, we've got to get to the children. But over time, what we could see is it's almost impossible to get to the children, because to get to the children, you have to get to the teachers and the parents. The children are the easy part. It's the adults that come to, I mean, just take the fair-minded Fran, selfish Sam, and naive Nancy. Now, a lot of people would say, now you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be using a female name or a male name. But little kids don't think like that.
Oh,
They
hey, it's
say,
Todd. Yeah.
right? They say selfish Sam. Well, yeah, sometimes I am selfish. They don't say, oh, it's for just guys that are selfish. Do you see what I mean? They see selfishness in themselves. They see that they're sometimes fair. They see that they're sometimes naive. They get the point that we're trying to make. And so adults will often come in with, like, they don't like this theory and they don't want that theory, and this theory is really bothering them, and they don't think they can work through this theory. But with little kids, you could just say, just try it. Just try it, and just ask yourself, were you being fair when you push that person down? And is that how you want to be as a human being? And you see, it's why I say this is so easy, it's hard in certain ways.
I
So
understand.
if you can see your selfishness, then you ought to be able to do something about it, theoretically.
Right. I was more saying, like, it's frustrating trying to teach that to other people,
Yes.
because it's like speaking a different language sometimes.
But this is why I think we have to teach the theory of egocentric and sociocentric thinking, which you see in our Thinker's Guide to the Human Mind. This is essential theory. And you can't teach critical thinking without teaching theory, as I said in the beginning. So they need this theory. They need to realize, okay, you know, I'm being egocentric right now. I'm being selfish. I'm stuck within one point of view. I can't seem to get out of this point of view. They've got to see those as patterns that we all experience. And then they've got to apply those patterns to themselves on a regular basis. And all of us need to be doing this more or less throughout the day. So this is one of the reasons why we are doing these webinars, and we're trying to continue, you know, your learning so that you can, you know, you'll get some questions answered now, go and do some work, come back, you see, and go a little further. But I know it's very challenging. Trust me, I feel the weight of that question and that problem. And all you can do is focus on your circle of influence. But learning the theory so you can teach it would be my best suggestion. And you're welcome. And Jose.
Yeah, one funny anecdote, and I will relate it to the foundation in a moment, is that I was talking to a professor of graduate school, and we're talking about critical thinking, and I introduced the ethics or the morality in the thinking. And he said, what does that have to do with thinking?
Mhm.
And which is interesting, because in the framework of the foundation, you cannot reach a level of becoming a critical thinker unless you have ethics.
Mhm.
So the name critical thinking, in fact, does a disservice to the vision that the foundation has, because
Mhm.
everybody thinks about, oh, that must be something about how to think better, how to think more effectively, how to
Mhm.
think or reason in a more efficient or effective way. The
Mhm.
reality is you can be a great thinker, and if you ethically are low, that's it. I mean, you're dead there.
Absolutely.
Right?
Mhm.
So the point is, if this course was named ethical reasoning, it
Mhm.
would resonate much better with the vision of the foundation
Mhm.
than the word thinking. I mean, it takes away the punch.
It's interesting. This is something we've debated over many years, and we try to use the term fair-minded critical thinking so that it's clear. But if you understand a rich conception of critical thinking, then you understand, for example, if you understand the elements and the standards, then you know that you've got to consider all relevant viewpoints when reasoning through a problem. You see? So the question determines the viewpoints that you have to consider. You don't determine that. You, the thinker, don't get to decide that. The question lays out the intellectual task for you, which again includes the relevant viewpoints. So if you understand critical thinking in this more rich way, then you see basically what I'm trying to say. But unfortunately, you see, critical thinking, as I've mentioned many times, it suffers for a lot of reasons. One is that it's not a bona fide field of study that is acknowledged in academia. So it's owned and operated by other disciplines. So that's going to be a problem. And then now it's become a buzz term across human societies. And now many consulting type people and writers are stealing and using one or two ideas, and they're, the 4 ways to change the world, whatever those are. And this is muddying the concept. So what I would say is, I hear what you're saying, and there are always better ways to reach people, but and the ethical dimension has always been part of our work. But ethics, if we were to do, let's say, a workshop just on ethics, ethics is a very difficult subject for people generally, because to understand ethics is to understand how ethics is distinguished from social ideologies, laws, and religious beliefs. So wherever you have, for example, religious beliefs entering the discussion, it's going to be a little more difficult. And what we have to see there is, any given religion may or may not have ethical dimensions. And it is ethics that determines that. You see, so ethics is a set of principles in and of itself. And so to determine whether your particular religion is ethical, we would have to use these ethical principles and see how well what you're doing connects with those principles, and what practices you're engaging in that do not encourage ethical reasoning or discourage ethical reasoning. Do you see?
Yeah.
So there is a lot to ethics that we would need to discuss in order for us to be clear about what we even mean by that. But in a general way, we can say considering the rights and needs of others, and considering how your life, your behavior affects other people. And again, this is something that Socrates was very concerned about. And he said at the very end of his life, now, if I will say this poorly, but he will say, now I'm leaving behind my children, and if they behave as if they were good for something when they are good for nothing, I hope that you will basically harass me the way I have harassed you will harass them the way I have harassed you. I hope that you will not let them hear the end of it. And he means by that living the ethical life. And so, and I do think this was one of the main reasons why he had to be eliminated, because the powers that be did not want that. They wanted their interest to reign. So yes, this is a very good point. So we thank you, everyone. It's been an hour and a half. We'll close now. Thank you for staying with us through the entire time, and hopefully this has been valuable for you. And you know that we there's a lot in critical thinking, and we can always we can often look at these topics from multiple perspectives, and I know I've done that. So hopefully something is percolating with you, and that you will keep coming back and asking your questions and letting us know what you'd like to see in the community. So thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening, and I'll see you soon.